Nietzsche's most dangerous discovery wasn't about morality, God, or nihilism. It was about what happens when a human being sees beyond the illusions that sustain civilization. It was about the curse of seeing too much. Nietzsche documented, through his own agonizing experience, what happens when someone perceives the fundamental lies upon which society is built. He called this the vision of the abyss. When you look through the curtains of culture and see the emptiness behind it, individuals who develop this clarity of perception inevitably find themselves isolated, misunderstood, and often on the verge of madness, not because they are unbalanced, but because carrying the weight of this consciousness has a psychological cost that few are willing to pay. Today, I will show why Nietzsche believed that seeing too deeply is both a curse and the only path to genuine authenticity. The case that revealed Nietzsche's most disturbing discovery began with his own experience. The son of a Protestant pastor, raised in an environment of rigid Christian morality, Nietzsche was trained to see the world through the lens of European religious tradition, but something inside him didn't fit. From an early age, he sensed an incongruity between what he was taught and what he intuitively perceived. Nietzsche wrote, "It was not doubt that consumed me, but the ability to see through the justifications that others accepted without question." As his perception deepened, he began to see beyond the moral, religious, and social constructs that sustained 19th century society. What he saw left him simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Nietzsche perceived that Christianity, far from being a doctrine of love, was fundamentally a system of psychological control based on the resentment of the weak against the strong. He saw that moral values were not divine or absolute, but historical creations that served specific purposes of power. He saw that reason and science, considered objective and neutral, were permeated with unexamined metaphysical assumptions. In essence, he saw that everything European society considered sacred, permanent, and true was, in reality, a human construction, a scaffold of necessary fictions to avoid facing the emptiness and inherent lack of purpose in existence. This perception wasn't merely intellectual. Nietzsche felt it in his body, in his psyche, as a constant and inescapable presence. He wrote, "I cannot close my eyes to what I have seen, nor can I unlearn the clarity with which I now perceive. I am condemned to live in a world stripped of its consoling illusions." This state of perpetual clarity created in him a fundamental separation from society. He could no longer participate in social games, small lies, and compromises that make collective life possible. Each social interaction required him to pretend to believe in truths he saw as fabrications. Nietzsche realized that this clarity was a dangerous condition. He discovered that there was a reason why most people lived in a state of semi-consciousness, accepting collective norms and truths without questioning deeply. Unconsciousness wasn't just a defect, it was a necessary adaptation for social survival. He wrote, "Truth is a bottomless sea where most would drown. It takes an extraordinary physiology to withstand the vision of reality without masks." In his private notes, he documented how his deepest insights led him not to peace, but to states of almost unbearable anguish. The 1880s, the period of his most intense philosophical production, were also years of physical suffering and growing isolation. His health deteriorated, friendships disappeared, his works were misunderstood or ignored. He was experiencing what he would later define as the great solitude, the inevitable condition of one who can no longer share the common understanding of reality. How could he communicate what he saw to those whose very identity depended on not seeing? What made Nietzsche's discovery truly dangerous was his perception that the problem wasn't just in the content of what he saw, but in the very capacity to see with excessive clarity. This hyper-consciousness created an insurmountable distance between him and others. He commented, "It's not that I know more, it's that I can no longer not know." This condition of not being able to unsee manifested in his own body. The terrible migraines, digestive problems, insomnia, all symptoms of a nervous system overloaded by intensified consciousness. Nietzsche identified three distinct manifestations of this curse, of seeing too much. First manifestation, the disenchantment of the world. When you see through cultural constructions, the world loses its inherited mystery and meaning. The myths, rituals, and symbols that offer comfort to others reveal themselves as arbitrary constructs. The stories that give meaning and purpose to collective life appear as necessary fictions, but no less fictitious. Nietzsche wrote, "The world we could interpret to contain God's moral purpose and certainties has disappeared. What remains is a void that few can face directly." This perception wasn't just intellectual, it was a visceral experience of displacement and estrangement. Second manifestation, existential isolation. Those who see what others cannot or will not see inevitably find themselves alone. Nietzsche observed, "Each step toward deeper truths is a step away from others' understanding. This loneliness isn't merely social, but existential. You're not just misunderstood, you become essentially incomprehensible. Your insights cannot be communicated because the very categories of thought available in common language are insufficient. You become, as Nietzsche described himself, a posthumous man, someone who lives after the end of the world that others still inhabit. Third manifestation, the vertigo of freedom. When you realize that values, meanings, and purposes are created, not discovered, you find yourself in a state of radical freedom, what Nietzsche called the open sea. There are no longer any absolute foundations, no external compass, no reliable map. This condition generates psychological vertigo. When you gaze long into the abyss also gazes into you. The perception of the absence of foundations can be psychologically devastating. Many who glimpse this abyss retreat in terror, desperately clinging to the illusions they momentarily abandoned. Nietzsche realized there was a historical pattern of people who saw beyond the veil of collective illusions. He studied figures like Heraclitus, who eventually withdrew to the mountains, Socrates, condemned to death by his society, Jesus, whose message was so misunderstood that it transformed into the opposite of what he intended. The pattern was clear. Society does not forgive those who expose its fundamental contradictions and necessary illusions. They are marginalized, persecuted, or more often misinterpreted until their messages are domesticated and incorporated into the system they intended to challenge. But Nietzsche discovered something even more disturbing. Isolation and misunderstanding were just the beginning. The true danger of hyperconsciousness was what he called the temptation of nothingness, the attraction to nihilism as a response to the loss of inherited meanings. He wrote, "The greatest danger is not seeing that everything is empty of intrinsic meaning. It is concluding that, therefore, nothing matters." Nietzsche recognized in himself, and in other hyperconscious individuals, this tendency to slide from liberating insight into self-destructive negation. This is why many who see too deeply end up self-destructing in some form. Some, like Van Gogh, are consumed by the intensity of their own perception. Others, like Hölderlin, succumb to madness. Still others, like Kierkegaard, take refuge in a paradoxical faith that acknowledges its own impossibility. Nietzsche himself experienced a mental collapse at 44, after which he lived a decade in a state of diminished consciousness, cared for by his mother and sister. But before his collapse, Nietzsche had arrived at a crucial understanding, perhaps the most important of his discoveries. The curse of seeing too much could be transformed into a gift if the individual developed rare psychological capacities. He called this the work of the free spirit, the ability to endure the truth without succumbing to nihilism or nostalgia for lost illusions. In Beyond Good and Evil, he described this process. The free spirit learns not only to endure, but to love his solitude. He transforms necessity into virtue, wound into strength. Nietzsche identified 3 phases in this transformation of curse into creative power. Phase 1, necessary destruction. The first phase is essentially negative. It's the period when the individual sees through illusions, discards idols, abandons comfortable certainties. It's a time of isolation and often intense suffering. Nietzsche compared this phase to a snake that needs to shed its skin, a painful and vulnerable process, but necessary for growth. He wrote, "The spirit that wants to be free must first say no to much of what is considered sacred and untouchable. This negation is the necessary, though insufficient, beginning of all genuine creation." Phase 2, amor fati. After the destructive phase comes what Nietzsche considered the crucial test, the ability to affirm life even after seeing its lack of foundation. He called this amor fati, love of fate, the acceptance and even celebration of existence exactly as it is, without need for transcendental justifications or promises of redemption. My formula for human greatness is amor fati, wanting nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not for all eternity. This is the moment of conversion, when the weight of perception transforms into lightness, when the abyss of meaning transforms into openness for creation. Phase 3, creation of values. The final and most difficult phase is creation. After deconstructing inherited values and affirming existence without them, the free spirit must now create new values, not universal or absolute values. Nietzsche considered such pretension a relapse into old metaphysics, but values that recognize their own contingency and yet are affirmed with full force. The true test of a noble spirit is not its ability to destroy idols, but to create values that make life more intense and meaningful, even knowing they are creations. not discoveries. This creation requires extraordinary psychological strength, what Nietzsche called will to power in its deepest sense, not domination over others but mastery over oneself. The most revealing aspect of Nietzsche's discovery was his perception that seeing too much could not be cured by diminishing vision, but only by intensifying it to a point of transformation. The clarity that initially causes suffering, when taken to its ultimate consequences, can transform into a kind of lucid ecstasy. Nietzsche called this experience the joy of tragic knowledge, the ability to look at the abyss without masks, and yet dance on its edge, the spirit that has carried the heaviest burden, the death of God, the absence of transcendent meaning, and has not been crushed but transformed, achieves a lightness no believer will ever know. This transformation, however, wasn't merely individual. Nietzsche believed that those who endured the curse of seeing too much served, even if involuntarily, as evolutionary pioneers for human consciousness. He wrote, "He who sees too far, who sees too early, must wait a long time to be caught up with. Others will need decades, perhaps centuries, to face the same truths. The hyperconscious individual suffers not just for himself, but for the species. He is the laboratory, where new forms of consciousness are being tested, often at great personal cost." In the years after Nietzsche's death, the 20th century confirmed many of his darkest insights. The death of God, he had announced, the collapse of the transcendental foundations of Western civilization, manifested in the great wars, totalitarian regimes, extermination camps. The nihilism he had identified as the most uncanny of all guests became the prevailing spiritual climate. The condition that had been his personal curse became increasingly a collective cultural condition. Today we live in a world where hyperconsciousness has become more common, although it rarely reaches the depth and radicality of Nietzsche's experience. The curse of seeing too much affects more and more people who can no longer believe in the consoling narratives that sustain our civilization: unlimited progress, technology as salvation, consumption as the path to happiness, perpetual economic growth on a finite planet. They feel in their bodies and psyches the weight of this clarity. Like Nietzsche, many experience this clarity as a form of existential exile. What can we learn from Nietzsche's journey through the curse of seeing too much? First, that clarity of perception has a price. Seeing through collective illusions does not bring liberation first, but isolation. It doesn't bring peace, but intensity. It doesn't solve problems. It creates new, deeper, more personal ones. Second, that this curse can be transformed, not by diminishing vision, but by intensifying it to the point where perception becomes creation. Third, that the path of the hyperconscious is necessarily a solitary path, but not necessarily a path of despair. Nietzsche offered this advice for those who, like him, suffer from the curse of seeing too much. Live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. Send your ships into uncharted seas. Live at war with your equals and with yourself. Be robbers and conquerors, as long as you cannot be rulers and possessors. In other words, accept the danger of clarity and transform it into art, philosophy, new forms of life that may eventually show others possibilities they cannot yet see for themselves. In his last lucid writings, Nietzsche predicted the emergence of what he called free spirits, individuals who would be able to bear the weight of clarity without succumbing to nihilism or resorting to metaphysical consolations. These would be the true philosophers of the future, not builders of abstract systems, but existential experimenters who would test in their own lives the limits and possibilities of human consciousness. They will be people who have experienced all heights and depths, who have descended to the darkest abyss and climbed to the brightest heights, and who have returned with new eyes, able to see beauty where others see only chaos and absurdity. The curse of seeing too much in its final manifestation is no curse at all, but the only path to an authenticity that does not depend on illusions. It is the path that Nietzsche called becoming who you are, a journey that begins with the painful perception of the absence of foundations and ends with the courageous creation of meaning in the face of the abyss. You must become who you are. It's the only imperative that remains when all other imperatives are recognized as human constructions, all too human. If you recognize yourself in these descriptions, if you feel the weight of seeing beyond what others see, know that you are not alone, even in your inevitable solitude. Nietzsche, writing for readers who had not yet been born, left these words: "For new ears, new music. For new eyes, new horizons." Your curse may be the prelude to a transformation not just personal, but potentially cultural. If you're ready to explore more deeply how to transform the curse of seeing too much into a creative power, subscribe to this channel where I explore the strategies of history's great free spirits for navigating the most dangerous territories of consciousness. Watch now the video on your screen about how to develop the capacity to bear truths that others cannot face without falling back into nihilism or nostalgia for lost illusions. Remember, your burden is not seeing too much, but not having yet learned to transform that vision into dance. As Nietzsche said, I would only believe in a God who could dance. That dance begins when you fully accept that seeing the abyss doesn't mean falling into it. It means creating something so powerful that even the abyss becomes just another stage for your self-overcoming. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next dimension.